In the Hebrew scriptures of the Bible, several prophets spoke of the day of Jehovah, or a day belonging to Jehovah. The description that they make of Jehovah's day leaves no doubt that it refers especially to a time when God rises up to execute judgment on the wicked and those who are his enemies or who attack his people. Nevertheless, at times, different days of Jehovah also came down with much fury and punishment on the ancient nation of Israel on account of their wayward behavior and their callous transgressions of God's laws, which they had committed themselves to obeying. At Deuteronomy 10, verse 17, Jehovah had warned the Israelites that he treats none with partiality. Hence, if they obeyed him, he would bless them, their land, and their livestock. But if they disobeyed him, he would punish them accordingly, according to Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 through 17. He further told them, "You will take much seed out into the field, but you will gather little, because the locust will devour it. Vineyards you will plant and cultivate, but you will drink no wine and gather nothing, because the worm will consume it. Swarms of insects will overwhelm all your trees and the fruitage of your ground. All these curses will certainly come upon you and pursue you and overtake you until you have been annihilated, because you did not listen to the voice of Jehovah your God by keeping his commandments and his statutes that he commanded you." Deuteronomy 28, verses 38, 39, 42, and 45. Eventually, these divinely foretold curses overtook or became a reality for the Israelites around the time that Joel was serving as a prophet in the 8th century BCE. At that time, he announced Jehovah's day to that nation in these words, "Woe because of the day, for the day of Jehovah is near, and it will come like a destruction from the Almighty." Joel 1, verse 15. Joel's prophecy further mentioned massive swarms of locusts that, due to their sheer number, would screen out the brightness of the sun, the moon, and the stars, according to Joel chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. For years, the locusts had devastated the crops and grazing fields of that nation, bringing about widespread starvation among the livestock. The destruction caused by the locusts was intensified by subsequent droughts and wildfires, according to Joel chapter 1, verses 4, 10, 11, 18 through 20. Hence, the Jews in Joel's day had to repent of their transgressions and return to Jehovah. Only in this case would he reconsider the calamity that he had brought upon them by reversing its deadly effects in pouring out his blessings on those who repented, according to Joel chapter 2, verses 12 through 14, verse 18, in verses 21 through 26. Amos, another prophet who was likely a contemporary of Joel, prophesied against Israel, Judah, and other neighboring nations. Amos also spoke of a day of Jehovah that would come down upon them. However, Israel and Judah's overblown confidence in themselves led them to nurture wrong expectations regarding what the day of Jehovah would really mean for them. Despite their gross violations of God's laws, they still believed that the day of Jehovah would actually bring in a bright period of blessings and rewards to them, and for that reason, it was something that they should even yearn for. But what basis did they have to think that way? Well, they might have thought that if they kept attending the mandatory conventions and festivals in Jerusalem and continued to offer animal sacrifices according to the Mosaic law, and sing or play beautiful melodies of praise to Jehovah on their musical instruments, he would certainly overlook their widespread idolatry and hideous crimes. How pitifully mistaken they were, though, for this is what Jehovah told them through his prophet Amos. Woe to those who yearn for the day of Jehovah. What then will the day of Jehovah mean for you? It will be darkness and not light. It will be like a man who flees from a lion and is confronted by a bear. And when he enters his house and leans his hand against the wall, a snake bites him. Will not the day of Jehovah be darkness and not light? Will it not have gloom and not brightness? I despise your festivals, and I take no pleasure in the aroma of your solemn assemblies. Even if you offer me whole burnt offerings and gift offerings, I will find no pleasure in them, and I will not look with favor on your communion sacrifices of fattened animals. Spare me the din of your songs, and let me not hear the melodies of your stringed instruments. Amos chapter 5, verses 18 through 23. What do we learn from this account? That just being a member of a religious organization or someone who regularly attends meetings at a church or a kingdom hall, or someone who sings praises to God in large conventions or assemblies, or even someone who preaches to others, all these things do not per se guarantee that such person will be saved or spared in Jehovah's forthcoming day. A whole lot more is required, according to what you may see later at Isaiah 1 verses 15, 16, Proverbs 28 verse 9, Mark 12 verses 38 through 40, 1 Corinthians 9 verse 27, and Romans 2 verses 21 through 24. The Bible tells us that when the predicted day of Jehovah came down on the idolatrous kingdom of Israel, the Assyrians invaded its territory and took the Israelites into exile and scattered them among other vassal nations, according to the account of Amos 5, verse 27, chapter 6, verse 7, in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 5 through 18. More than a century later, the predicted day of Jehovah also came down on the kingdom of Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, destroyed Jerusalem and exiled the Jews, according to the accounts of 2 Kings 25, verses 1 through 21, 2 Chronicles 36, verses 37 or 17 through 20, and Amos chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. Other neighboring nations, such as Edom, Moab, Ammon, and Egypt, experienced the deadly effects of the day of Jehovah when they also fell to Nebuchadnezzar around that time, according to the accounts of Jeremiah 25, verses 8 through 11, verses 17 through 24, Ezekiel 30, verses 8 through 11, and verses 24 through 26. The prophet Isaiah further prophesied against Edom and those nations that shared borders with the kingdom of Judah, on account of their having rejoiced over the bad things that happened to Jerusalem and the Jews back then. Isaiah wrote that Jehovah had a day of vengeance, a year of retribution for the legal case over Zion or Jerusalem, according to Isaiah 34, verse 8. Edom and the other nations would be completely destroyed on account of their cruelty toward the Jews who were trying to escape the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Hence, Jehovah would battle against all their army, according to Obadiah verses 8 through 15. Isaiah foretold that in the heavens, or in the high spheres of ruling power of Edom and those other nations, Jehovah's sword would be drenched in their blood and descend upon them with destructive force. That is how the army of their heavens, or the military forces of the rulers of Edom and those other nations, would rot away after being slain by Jehovah, according to Isaiah 34, verses 4 through 6. Regarding the meaning of certain words, such as heavens or earth, in some biblical prophecies, you may still recall that in our first video, titled Divine Warnings for Our Times, we explained that both the spiritual and human rulers are at times referred to in the Bible as symbolic heavens that rise above the symbolic earth, or the human society as a whole, according to Ephesians 6, verse 12, Daniel 4, verse 26, Matthew 7, verse 21, Isaiah 13, verses 1 and 13, Genesis 11, verse 1, in Psalm 66, verse 4. In the case of Isaiah's prophecy regarding the symbolic heavens of Edom, Ammon, and Moab, their ruling authorities would be rolled up like a scroll, just as a reader does when he discards an old, worthless scroll for good after reading it. After rolling up the symbolic heavens of those nations, like a worthless scroll, Jehovah would also make the army of those heavens wither away in death. Therefore, the pages of those nations' history, so to speak, would be rolled up for good and thus come to their end. Edom and those neighboring nations would eventually end up in smoke, and the symbolic fire of their destruction would last forever, according to Isaiah 34, verses 2 through 6, verses 8 through 10, Obadiah verses 1 through 4, in verses 10 through 15. Isaiah prophesied further about a day of Jehovah that would come down on the mighty Babylonian Empire, at which time the sun, the moon, and the stars of the heavens would grow dark and tremble, and the earth would be shaken out of its place, according to Isaiah 13, verses 1, 6, 9, 10, and 13. Seeing that these things did not happen in a literal way, what does it all mean then? It means that the constituent elements of the symbolic heavens, or all the components of the ruling authority of Babylon, which in Isaiah's prophecy were likened to the sun, the moon, and the stars, would not be able to give off any light or provide their subjects with any ray of hope or a clear strategy for survival. The situation brought about by the day of Jehovah would become so desperate that the king himself and all the members of his royal staff that made up the symbolic heavens of Babylon would sink into complete darkness, not knowing what to do, and they would tremble with fear in the face of their own impending destruction at the hands of the Medes and the Persians when these invaded Babylon in 539 BCE, according to Isaiah 13, verses 7, 8, 11, 17, and Daniel chapter 5, verses 30, 31. Isaiah's prophecy reveals that the symbolic earth, or the general population of Babylon, would then be shaken out of its place, in the sense that the ordinary people would scramble to get away from the condemned territory, which would eventually become a deserted place, a condition that has remained virtually unchanged down to this day, according to Isaiah 13, verses 12, 14 through 16, and 18 through 22. A similar prophecy is found in the book of Joel regarding a day of Jehovah that would come down as executional judgment on Philistia and the Phoenician city-states of Tyre and Sidon over the heartless way they dealt with some of the poor Jews who had been allowed to remain in the territory of Judah and who had not been taken by Nebuchadnezzar as exiles to Babylon. Joel foretold that during the executional judgment brought about by that particular day of Jehovah, not only the sun and the moon would become dark and the stars would lose their brightness, but the heaven and the earth would rock as well, according to the prophecy. Nevertheless, there is no record that these things ever came to pass in a literal way back then. Hence, like in the case of what happened to Babylon when Jehovah's day came down on it, the things that Joel foretold in regard to Philistia, Tyre, and Sidon, had a similar symbolic fulfillment on those condemned nations and their rulers, according to Joel 3, verses 2 through 6, and verses 12 through 16. While these biblical accounts provide us with just a few samples of small-scale days of Jehovah that came down on various nations at different times in the distant past, the prophetic word reveals that there is yet one day of Jehovah that will be the greatest of all days, as it is set to break soon on all the nations of the world and their rulers. How do you know that? Although the general predictions associated with the different days of Jehovah had their fulfillment in the experience of the ancient nations and peoples that we just talked about, certain passages in those prophecies were meant to have a greater fulfillment in the future. Take, for example, the prophecy of Joel, chapter 2, verses 28 through 32. The Apostle Peter applied the fulfillment of that particular prophecy to the events related to the pouring out of the Holy Spirit on the first group of Christian Jews gathered together in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, 33 CE. While addressing thousands of devout non-Christian Jews who had come from many parts of the world for the celebration of the Jewish festival of Pentecost, and who had heard the small group of Christians speak in the foreign languages of those visitors about the magnificent things of God, the Apostle Peter said these words as found at Acts 2, verses 5 and 16 through 21. This is what was said through the prophet Joel. And in the last days, God says, I will pour out some of my spirit on every sort of flesh. And your sons and your daughters will prophesy, and your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams, and even on my male slaves and on my female slaves I will pour out some of my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. And I will give wonders in heaven above, and signs on earth below, blood and fire in clouds of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and illustrious day of Jehovah comes. And everyone who calls on the name of Jehovah will be saved. On the occasion, Peter told those crowds of devout Jews that they should repent and be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for forgiveness of their sins, and then they would also receive the free gift of the Holy Spirit, as that was a promise to them and their children and to whomever Jehovah might call to himself. Peter further exhorted them to get saved from the crooked generation of that time. The response was positive, as about 3,000 became baptized Christians on that very same day. Moreover, Jehovah's Spirit enabled the apostles to perform many wonders and signs in public, according to Acts 2, verses 38 through 41 in verse 43. Just a few days later, while addressing another larger crowd of non-Christian Jews in Jerusalem, the same Apostle Peter urged them to repent and turn around so that their sins might get blotted out. The account tells us that about 5,000 of those who listened to Peter's speech became Christians as well, according to Acts chapter 3, verse 19 and chapter 4, verse 4. In his speech, Peter also told them about the time when Jehovah will send Jesus Christ down from heaven for the second time, according to Acts 3, verse 20, in Hebrews 9, verse 28. When Peter said those words, Jesus Christ had just recently returned to heaven after coming down to earth for the first time and sat down at the right hand of his Father Jehovah God. The Apostle Peter further said, heaven must hold this one, that is Jesus Christ, within itself for how long? Until the times of restoration of all things, of which God spoke through the mouth of his holy prophets of old. Acts 3, verse 21. Hence, Peter left no doubt that when the time comes for God to restore all things according to his original purpose for humankind in this planet, he will authorize his Son to leave heaven for the second time and return as the new King of the world and bring it into complete subjection to his theocratic rule. Since his ascension back to heaven in 1933 CE, Jesus Christ has been waiting for the time when all the enemies will be placed under his kingly authority or as a stool for his feet. This will happen in heaven, when Jehovah installs him in heaven as the new King of the world, according to Psalm 110, verse 1, Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14, Hebrews 10, verses 12 and 13, in Revelation 11, verse 15. This glorious event, which is now so near, will mark the real beginning of Jehovah and Jesus Christ's great and awesome day in our times, according to Joel 2, verse 31. In the meantime, Satan and his demons are still acting as invisible rulers of this world from their heavenly places or elevated positions of governmental authority in the spirit realm, as we explained in our first video titled Divine Warnings for Our Times, according to Luke chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, John 12, verse 31, chapter 14, verse 30, chapter 16, verse 31, Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 and 12, in 1 John chapter 5, verse 19. But Satan's wicked kingdom will soon be overthrown during Jehovah and Jesus Christ's great day, and only then is that God's kingdom will begin to rule, as we will still see further ahead. Revelation 12, verses 7 through 10. Hence, while the events that took place on the day of Pentecost 33 CE certainly fulfilled some of the things that had been foretold by the prophet Joel, there were other things that did not happen on that occasion. What are those things? Joel's prophecy, as quoted by the Apostle Peter, talked about wonders in heaven and signs on earth besides blood, fire, and clouds of smoke. It also talked about the darkening of the sun and the moon. These are things that did not happen on the day of Pentecost 33 CE, whether in a literal or symbolic way. Therefore, They were meant to take place at the beginning of Jehovah and Jesus Christ's day in our times, as we will still see along this talk. Moreover, as we explained just a short while ago, the prophecy of Isaiah 34, verse 4, regarding the symbolic heavens that would be rolled up like a scroll, had a small-scale fulfillment on Edom and other neighboring nations. However, that prophecy will also have a global scale fulfillment in the near future, when Jehovah God and His Lamb, Jesus Christ, will manifest their wrath against this Satan-ruled world by means of a series of terrifying events that will culminate in Jehovah and Jesus Christ's great day. Toward the end of the 1st century CE, the Apostle John had symbolic visions that God gave him about those terrifying events. In one of those, he saw a red horse with a rider on it, who had been given a great sword and permission to take peace away from the earth or from among mankind, so that people would kill one another, according to Revelation 6, verses 3 and 4. It is evident that this visionary rider and his red horse stand for the sanguinary wars fought by the nations and the general bloodshed that in our violent times would indeed not only take peace away from humankind, but also reap millions of lives. The world has not yet forgotten that more than 100 million lives were snuffed out by this bloodthirsty horseman only in the 2 major wars fought in the last century. In recent years, more than 800,000 people have been killed directly in the wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and in other places. Several times as many civilians have also died as an indirect result of the wars, according to a report published a few months ago by the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. The Apostle John also saw a black horse, and the rider on it had a pair of scales in his hand. A voice was heard telling the rider, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the olive oil and the wine." Revelation 6, verses 5 and 6. In the 1st century CE, a denarius used to be the amount paid to a laborer for a full day of work, according to an example found at Matthew 20, verses 1 and 2. However, in John's vision, a denarius was how much a mere quart of high-priced wheat would be selling for, to feed just one person a day. But if the worker had a small family to feed, then he would be forced to buy the less nutritious and less costly barley instead of wheat. What about the olive oil and the wine? In the Middle East, they are considered to be staples, not luxuries. And so they were found even in the homes of poor people, according to the account of 1 Kings 17, verse 12. However, on account of the exorbitant food prices, people would still have to use them sparingly. Therefore, this rider on the black horse stands for famine and the skyrocketing food prices. As all of us know, these are problems that continue to affect millions of people around the world. The Apostle John further saw a pale or a greenish yellow horse, and its rider had a name, Death. He was followed up close by Hades. Revelation 6 verse 8 in the English Standard Version and in the New World Translation 1984 edition. But what is this Hades? And what does it stand for? On the day of Pentecost 33 CE, while talking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Apostle Peter quoted from Psalm 16, verses 8 through 11, where the Hebrew word Sheol is used as a reference to the general grave of the dead, according to the English Standard Version and the New American Standard Bible. Look, the inspired writer of Acts of Apostles translated the word Sheol into Hades in Greek, thus establishing a scriptural equivalence between them, according to Acts chapter 2, verses 24 through 32. Hence, Sheol and Hades stand for the general grave of the dead. While describing a vision that he had about the future resurrection of the dead, the Apostle John tells us that those who are in Hades are not alive, but dead. He said, "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death in Hades gave up the dead who were in them." Revelation 20, verse 13 in the English Standard Version. Revelation 1, verse 18 further tells us that Jesus Christ has the keys of death and of Hades, in the sense that he has the power to bring back to life those who died and are buried. In his vision, the Apostle John saw that both death and Hades received authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword and with famine and with pestilence and by the wild beasts of the earth, according to Revelation 6 verse 8 in the English Standard Version. The expression "a fourth of the earth" does not mean a strict 25% of the earth's population, which would amount to some 2 billion people today, if that expression were to be taken to the letter. Hence, it may rather stand for the uncountable millions of lives that would be destroyed by the insatiable death in Hades, according to Proverbs 27, verse 20. Like the two preceding horsemen, the rider Death and his companion Hades also reap the lives of both those who fall by their deadly sword and those whom they starve to death. No wonder recent reports estimate that over 9 million people die from hunger or hunger-related diseases every year. Death in Hades also kill with deadly plague, such as COVID-19 and other diseases, as well as by the hands of beast-like humans who kill fellow humans far more than irrational animals do. These terrifying visions that the Apostle John had tie in well with what Jesus Christ himself foretold 6 decades prior, while talking to his apostles in Jerusalem about the things that would occur shortly before his glorious return as the new king of the world. While answering their question about what would be the visible sign of his invisible return and presence and of the end of this age, Jesus said, among other things, You are going to hear of wars and reports of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be food shortages and earthquakes in one place after another. All these things are a beginning of pangs of distress. Matthew 24, verses 3, 6 through 8, in Mark 13, verse 7 and 8. In the account of Luke 21, verse 11, Jesus foretold the occurrence of pestilences or infectious diseases as well. When Jesus Christ spoke of these events as a beginning of pangs of distress, or as the beginning of birth pangs, which is a more literal translation of his words according to the New American Standard Bible, he was making a comparison between a woman's increasing labor pangs and the misery and affliction that would grip the whole world with ever greater force in the last days, according to Psalm 48, verse 6. In view of that, Jesus Christ then spoke of a period that he called Great Tribulation, when the occurrence of all the pangs that he had predicted would escalate and spread at an alarming rate throughout the world. Not a single nation or geographical location of our planet would be spared. The Great Tribulation, foretold by Jesus Christ, certainly had a small-scale fulfillment in the experience of the Jews who were in Jerusalem and in the province of Judea, when the Roman general Titus and his legions besieged the city and destroyed it a few months later in 70 CE, according to Luke 19, verse 43-44, chapter 21, verses 20 through 24, Matthew 24, verses 15 through 21, Mark 13, verses 14 through 19. Josephus, the Jewish historian who witnessed that tribulation up close, reported that 1,100,000 Jews lost their lives back then, including more than 600,000 who starved to death during the siege. But although that tribulation was indisputably the greatest ever to befall the Jews in Jerusalem theretofore, it could hardly be viewed as a tragedy worse than all the other slaughters, genocides, world wars, and famines that have happened in our own times as a result of the gallop of those three visionary horsemen of the apocalypse. Still, Jesus Christ referred to these things as a beginning of birth pangs, according to Matthew 24, verse 7 and 8, and Mark 13, verse 7 and 8. What does that tell us? That we may expect the combination of these events to get progressively worse from now on, as the apocalyptic writers keep revving up their horses to cover more territory, to spread misery and affliction and harvest more lives. The acceleration of their gallop will make the foretold birth pangs quickly reach their climax in the Great Tribulation. Therefore, it is in our times, in our days, that the Great Tribulation, foretold by Jesus, will have its intended global scale fulfillment. It is then that we may expect the complete realization of what he foretold at Mark 13, verse 19. For those days will be days of a tribulation such as has not occurred from the beginning of the creation that God created until that time, and will not occur again. Nevertheless, Jesus' words, as recorded both at Matthew 24, verse 22, and Mark 13, verse 20, give us basis to assert that the global tribulation, though intense, will not last long, for its days will be restricted or compressed into a short time span, and then it will pass away. With the tribulation's end, there will be a quick period of apparent relief and peace, which, for its turn, will induce the nations and their leaders to believe that the storm is finally over and that the world now enjoys peace and security. Nevertheless, even such wishful thinking will fulfill what the Apostle Paul wrote under inspiration at 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 2 and 3. There we read, "For you yourselves know very well that Jehovah's day is coming exactly as a thief in the night. Whenever it is that they are saying peace and security, then sudden destruction is to be instantly on them, just like birth pains on a pregnant woman, and they will by no means escape." Yes, the global tribulation, which could break out at any time, is just a precursor to Jehovah and Jesus Christ's fear-inspiring day, which will bring sudden destruction upon the entire world ruled by Satan and his agents, visible and invisible. See what Jesus Christ himself said regarding what will happen in that post-tribulation period. At Matthew 24, verse 29, we read, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days," the parallel account of Mark 13, verse 24 says, "But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will beat themselves in grief, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." The account of Luke 21, verses 25 and 26 says, "Also there will be signs in the sun and moon and the stars, and on the earth anguish of nations, not knowing the way out because of the roaring of the sea and its agitation. People will become faint out of fear and expectation of the things coming upon the inhabited earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken." Although Luke does not say that these events will occur after the global tribulation, both Matthew and Mark are straightforward about that. Based off what we have already considered regarding the various days of Jehovah that came down on ancient nations in their symbolical heavens, plus the darkening of their sun, moon, and the stars, and the metaphorical falling of their rulers like meteor showers out of their heavens or elevated positions of ruling authority, we could draw no other conclusion but that the same interpretation also applies to Jesus' words in the scriptures just read. However, we cannot absolutely rule out that in Jehovah and Jesus Christ, this fear-inspiring day, certain amazing phenomena in the physical heavens and in nature might also take place. Hence, based on what Jesus Christ foretold, today's world leaders, represented by the sun, moon, and the stars in their political heavens, will soon be in total darkness, not knowing what to do in the face of the executional judgment to be brought upon them and the rest of this Satan-ruled world by Jehovah and Jesus Christ's fast approaching great day. In the absence of light or guidance from their political leaders, the nations will be struck with fear and anguish on account of the roaring of the sea and the waves. If the expression roaring of the sea and its agitation is to have a literal fulfillment as a result of mighty submarine earthquakes, only time will reveal. However, it is likely that Jesus intended a symbolic application to his words in light of what Jehovah had said through his prophet Isaiah. The wicked are like the restless sea that cannot calm down, and its waters keep tossing up seaweed and mire. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked. Isaiah 57, verses 20-21. Moreover, it was long foretold that when the time arrived for Jehovah God to invest his Son Jesus Christ with kingly power over the world, the nations, like rough seas, would become agitated and their rulers would take a hostile stand toward God and his anointed one, or Christ, according to Psalm 2, verses 1 and 2. Jesus' prophetic words further indicate that the political rulers of the nations, represented by the powers of the current heavens, will be shaken out of their ruling positions by his messianic kingdom. No other kingdom or government belonging to wicked spirit forces or political rulers will be allowed to exist in parallel with the righteous kingdom of Jesus Christ when he takes over the kingdoms of the world on Jehovah's forthcoming day, according to Matthew 12, verse 29, Mark 3, verse 27, Luke 11, verses 21, 22, Revelation 12, verses 7 through 9, in chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. All the other kingdoms or governments will be overthrown by God's kingdom, according to what we read at Daniel 2, verse 44. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And this kingdom will not be passed on to any other people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, and it alone will stand forever. Therefore, Jesus Christ's words leave no doubt that the sign or the clear evidence of his invisible return and presence will be made manifest to the world with astoundingly kingly power only after the global tribulation, not before. We should also bear in mind that Christ's invisible presence is not detached from his return. These two things are strictly tied to each other. Hence, Jesus Christ will have to return as he himself promised, so that his presence or parousia may manifest itself to the nations by means of the supernatural events that will become visible throughout the world. These events will constitute the visible sign of his presence as the new king of the world. Another point that should be brought out is that the Bible does not teach that there will be two returns and two presences of Christ on two different occasions. There will be just one return whereby there will be just one presence. Hence, the Bible does not teach that Jesus Christ has already returned in 1914 or any other date in the past, thus making himself present before the Great Tribulation, nor that he will come back again during the tribulation and make himself present a second time in the future. Jesus Christ will certainly return as king and make himself present by means of that single return just once. And that return in presence of the King Jesus Christ will only take place after the upcoming global tribulation, not during, not before. Therefore, it is by means of that yet future return that the unmistakable evidence of Christ's invisible presence as King will be perceived by the whole world, according to Matthew 24, verses 3, 29, and 30, Mark 13, verses 24 through 26, in Revelation 1, verse 7. It is significant that in all of Jesus' prophetic words regarding his return, there is no indication that his investiture in heaven as the new king of the world would take place before the outbreak of the global tribulation. You can verify that by reading Matthew 24, verses 1 through 30, Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 26, and Luke chapter 21, verses 5 through 27. This is one of the reasons why Jesus Christ could never have returned or started his presence as the new king of the world in 1914 or any other date in the past. What Jesus Christ foretold regarding the end of this age and the beginning of a new one under God's kingdom is similar to another vision that the Apostle John had. At Revelation 6, verses 12 through 17, John tells us, "And I saw when he opened the sixth seal, and the great earthquake occurred, and the sun became black as sackcloth made of hair, and the entire moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as when a fig tree shaken by a high wind drops its unripe figs. And the heaven departed as a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and every island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the high officials, the military commanders, the rich, the strong, every slave and every free person, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they keep saying to the mountains and to the rocks, 'Fall over us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, because the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand?'" The events related to this highly symbolic vision that the Apostle John had at the opening of the sixth seal concerning the great earthquake that shakes the whole earth, the darkening of the sun and the moon, the falling of the stars, and the shaking of the powers of the heavens, all take place at the time that both Jehovah God and his Son Jesus Christ, the visionary Lamb, are wrathful against the nations and their rulers because of their opposition to the establishment of God's kingdom. Jehovah gave this warning through his prophet Haggai, "Yet once more, in a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land." Haggai chapter 2, verse 6. More than 500 years later, the Apostle Paul quoted this prophecy and indicated that it would be fulfilled in the future when the shaking of the heavens and the earth on Jehovah and Jesus Christ's great day would result in the complete and permanent crumbling and removal of all these symbolic elements so that God's kingdom that cannot be shaken might be put in place, according to Hebrews chapter 12, verses 26 through 28. In the same context, the Apostle Peter said that the heavens and the earth that now exist, referring to the current governments and the human society that lives under Satan's rule, are reserved for fire and are being kept until the day of judgment and of destruction of the ungodly people, according to 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Peter further said in verse 10 that Jehovah's day will come as a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, but the elements, being intensely hot, will be dissolved, and earth and the works in it will be exposed. Absolutely nothing pertaining to the current symbolic heavens and earth will survive the fiery executional judgment brought about by Jehovah and Jesus Christ's great day. Peter then gave this warning to all genuine Christians: since all these things are to be dissolved in this way, what sort of people you ought to be in holy acts of conduct and deeds of godly devotion, as you await and keep close in mind the presence of the day of Jehovah, through which the heavens will be destroyed in flames and the elements will melt in the intense heat. 2 Peter 3, verses 11 and 12. With the destruction of the wicked heavens and earth that now exist, the Apostle Peter tells us that there will be new heavens, or a new heavenly government presided over by Jehovah God and His Son Jesus Christ, and a new earth, or a new human society living under God's righteous kingdom. Even the turbulent sea of those who refuse to submit to God's theocratic rule will not be around anymore, according to 2 Peter 3, verse 13, in Revelation 21, verse 1. With regard to the physical heavens in our beautiful planet home, they will remain forever, as their existence not only provides an awesome testimony to Jehovah God's unsurpassable power and creative wisdom, but also plays an essential role in the realization of His original, never-changing purpose toward mankind and other creatures. You will find clear scriptural support for these statements in the book of Genesis chapters 1 and 2, Psalm 19 verses 1 through 6, Psalm 33 verses 11, Psalm 37 verses 9 through 11, 22, 29, 34, Psalm 84 verse 37, Psalm 104 verses 5 through 31, Psalm 115 verse 16, Proverbs 2 verses 21, 22, Isaiah chapter 40 verse 26, chapter 45 verse 18, chapter 55 verses 10 and 11, and Romans chapter 1 verses 19, 20. While describing another vision that he had after the seventh angel blew his trumpet, the Apostle John tells us, "And there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord Jehovah and of His Christ, and He will rule as king forever and ever. But the nations became wrathful, and your own wrath," there is God's wrath, "came, And the appointed time came for the dead to be judged, and to reward your slaves, the prophets, and the holy ones, and those fearing your name, the small and the great, and to bring to ruin those ruining the earth, according to Revelation 11, verses 15 and 18. For thousands of years, the nations have lived under the invisible ruling authority of Satan and his demons, doing the things that please them, not God. Therefore, it is understandable that the nations will not be willing to change and do the things that please God once His kingdom through Jesus Christ takes over. As a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul described the bad personality traits of the vast majority of those who would live in the last days of this Satan-ruled age. He said, but note this, that in the last days, critical times hard to deal with will be here. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, haughty, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, disloyal, having no natural affection, nor open to an agreement, slanderers, without self-control, fierce, without love of goodness, betrayers, headstrong, puffed up with pride, lovers of pleasures rather than lovers of God, having an appearance of godliness, but proving false to its power. And from these turn away. 2 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 5. Therefore, with such bad personality traits, it is evident that the nations and their rulers will react in a hostile way toward the establishment of Jehovah and Jesus Christ's righteous kingdom. A war will then break out, according to Psalm 2, verses 1 through 12, in Revelation 19, verses 11 through 19. The battleground of this global war, which will take place in the great day of God the Almighty, is symbolically referred to as Armageddon, and as the winepress of the fury, of the wrath of God the Almighty, where the wicked and the enemies of His kingdom will be trodden like grapes by His Son, Jesus Christ, and His angels, according to Revelation 16, verses 13, 14, and 16, in chapter 19, verses 15, 17 through 19, and verse 21. What does Armageddon mean? The word is a Greek transliteration derived from the Hebrew term Har-Megiddon, which means Mount of Megiddo. The Hebrew word Har means a mountain or a hill. Megiddo probably means assembly or gathering together of crowds or troops. In the Hebrew scriptures of the Bible, Megiddo is the name of an ancient Canaanite city in northern Israel, conquered by Joshua and then assigned to the tribe of Manasseh, according to Joshua 12, verses 7, 8, and 21, and chapter 17, verse 11. Contrary to what some might think, Megiddo was not built on a real natural elevation. The archaeological ruins of ancient Megiddo sit atop a 69-foot-high artificial mound or tell consisting of several layers of rubble, mud bricks, and building material laid on top of the other, where successive settlements were built by different civilizations on the same site. The flat summit of Tel Megiddo covers an area of about 10 acres, overlooking the fertile valley of Megiddo, also known as Valley of Jezreel or Plain of Asjalon. The valley covers an area of roughly 147 square miles. In ancient times, it was the scene of various military clashes due to its strategic location. It was in the valley of Megiddo that Barak defeated Jabin, the Canaanite king of Hazor, and his general Sisera, according to Judges chapter 4, verses 22 through 24, in chapter 5, verses 19-20. In the valley of Megiddo, King Josiah of Judah was killed by Egypt's Pharaoh Necho, according to 2 Kings 23, verse 29. Also in the valley, Gideon defeated the Midianites and the Amalekites, and King Saul was killed by the Philistines, according to Judges chapter 6 and 7 in 1 Samuel chapter 31. These biblical records and the basic geographical data that we present here clearly demonstrate that the small site of Tel Megiddo proper and its adjoining Furrow Valley, which today is the chief agricultural area, modern-day state of Israel, could never fit the description of the symbolic Armageddon mentioned at Revelation 16, verse 14 and 16, where the full weight of the armed forces of all the nations, along with their leaders, will converge upon for a global war, not against any specific nation of the world, but against Jehovah God and his then enthroned Son, Jesus Christ. It is a war against the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. The war stands for the nation's unified rejection of God's theocratic rule. Therefore, Armageddon is not a literal battleground, but a spiritual one, according to what is evidenced by the vision that the Apostle John describes at Revelation 19, verses 11 through 21. The Apostle John, who had these apocalyptic visions, says, "Then I saw, and look, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was someone like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and the sharp sickle in his hand," according to Revelation 14, verse 14. In this vision, Jesus Christ, the Son of Man, is first acting as the chief reaper of the symbolic harvest of the earth, according to Revelation 14, verses 15 and 16. Those who are righteous and thus likened to wheat will have their lives spared and will inherit the everlasting blessings of God's kingdom, while those who are wicked and thus likened to weeds will be destroyed forever, according to Matthew 13, verses 24 through 30, and verses 36 through 43, in Revelation 14, verses 15 and 16. In the same vision, Jesus Christ is also acting as the chief executioner of Jehovah's enemies, who are likened to clusters of ripe grapes ready to be hurled into the winepress of God's anger and crushed, according to Revelation 14, verses 18 and 19. An interesting feature about this vision is that Jesus Christ is seen wearing a golden crown on his head, which corroborates the fact that the events related to Armageddon, which is the symbolic battleground of the war of the great day of God the Almighty, will only take place after his investiture in heaven as the new king of the world, namely in the post-tribulation period. The enemies of God's kingdom will look for shelter in the symbolic caves of their collapsed political structures, which, before the establishment of God's kingdom, might have looked like unshakable mountains, but now are stripped of their ruling power. Hence, their search for help and protection will be in vain. Nothing will be able to hide God's enemies from the beaming eyes of Jesus Christ which at Revelation 19, verse 12, are likened to a fiery flame, nor from the sharp, long sword that protrudes out of his mouth, with which he will strike the nations, according to Revelation 19, verses 15 and 21. For obvious reasons, at Armageddon, the fleshly enemies of God's kingdom would never be able to launch a direct attack on the glorified Jesus Christ and his invisible angelic armies in heaven. But Satan knows who on earth are the loyal subjects of Jehovah and his Son, Jesus Christ. It must therefore be against those loyal subjects of God's kingdom that the then overthrown Satan will instigate the nations and their leaders to wage a persecutory war with a view to destroying them, according to Revelation 12, verse 17. This situation is symbolized by the battleground called Armageddon. But the then installed King, Jesus Christ, and his angelic legions will intervene in behalf of God's genuine servants and deliver them from their enemies, according to Revelation 17, verse 14. The survivors of Jehovah and Jesus Christ's great day will then be ushered into a new world where all of today's woes and afflictions will forever belong in the past, and all things will be made new by the carrying out of Jehovah's perfect and righteous will on earth through the millennial kingdom of his Son, Jesus Christ, according to Matthew 6, verse 10, in Revelation 21, verses 3 through 5. The Scriptures advise us to pay attention to the prophetic word as to a lamp shining in a dark place, according to 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 19. At Revelation 1, verse 3, the Apostle John tells us, "Blessed is he who reads, and those who hear the words of the prophecy, and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near." Therefore, we should do our utmost to be among those who will succeed in escaping all these things that must occur, and in standing before the Son of Man, for Jehovah and Jesus Christ's great day has drawn near. Now, we want to encourage you to be on the lookout for more videos that we will post in the following weeks with other important biblical themes. You are further invited to subscribe to our channel and activate its notifications. Thank you again for your kind attention.